In a windowless, concrete-lined basement in Hawaii, shielded from the tropical sun, one man was reading the enemy's mind. He and his team worked amidst a chaotic symphony of clicking typewriters and rustling papers, fueled by stale coffee and nervous energy. They knew a trap was being set, a massive, intricate operation designed to annihilate what was left of the American fleet. The problem? It wasn't their trap. Halfway across the world, aboard the largest battleship ever built, another man stared at the very same plan with a cold, creeping dread. He was the architect of Japan's greatest victory, but as he reviewed the details of this new, ambitious gamble, every instinct honed by decades at sea screamed that it was wrong. He knew his own side was sailing into a disaster of their own making. This is the story of two brilliant minds on opposite sides of a war. It is the story of the Battle of Midway. But more than that, it is the story of how one of them saw the future with perfect clarity, and how he was tragically, catastrophically ignored. In April 1942, aboard the battleship Yamato, anchored at Hashirajima in Japan's inland sea, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat alone in his cabin. Before him lay the operational plan for what would be known as Operation MI, the attack on Midway Atoll. On paper, it was a masterpiece of naval strategy, a symphony of destruction involving multiple fleets, diversionary attacks, and a decisive final battle. It was designed to lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet, crippled but not destroyed at Pearl Harbor, into a final, fatal confrontation. But as Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, read through the elegant, complex details, a cold dread settled in his stomach. He was a man who had dedicated over 30 years of his life to the sea. He had planned operations, commanded fleets, and studied the grand chess game of naval strategy with a master's eye. And everything about this plan felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. It was too complex, with too many moving parts spread across thousands of miles of ocean. It was built on too many assumptions. Most troublingly, it was based on a premise that Yamamoto, unlike nearly all of his colleagues, knew was dangerously false: that America was weak, demoralized, and incapable of fighting back effectively. Yamamoto knew better. He knew better because, unlike most Japanese officers who saw America as a decadent, materialistic society, he had actually lived there. He had studied at Harvard University. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He had traveled the breadth of the country, seen the endless fields of oil derricks in Texas, witnessed the roaring furnaces of Pittsburgh's steel mills, and walked the sprawling factory floors of Detroit. He understood, with a clarity that terrified him, that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant, a giant that, once fully roused, would crush Japan under an avalanche of steel, oil, and industrial might that no amount of Japanese fighting spirit or Yamato Damashi could ever hope to overcome. He had tried to warn his superiors before the attack on Pearl Harbor. He told them bluntly that Japan could only hope to win a short war, 6 months, maybe a year at most. After that, American industrial production would simply overwhelm them. They dismissed his concerns as pessimistic. After all, the attack on Pearl Harbor had been a stunning, almost unbelievable success. The lightning victories that followed across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, in the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, had convinced everyone in the high command that Yamamoto was being overly cautious. But now, looking at the Midway plan, Yamamoto knew the 6-month window was closing fast. This operation, this overly ambitious, arrogant gamble might be the very mistake that slammed that window shut forever. But he was trapped. The plan had already been approved by Imperial General Headquarters. The Emperor himself had been briefed. To oppose it now would be to question the judgment of his superiors and the wisdom of the High Command. In the rigid, hierarchical world of the Imperial Japanese Navy, such dissent was not merely discouraged. It was career-ending and possibly life-ending. So Yamamoto did what competent men throughout history have done when trapped in systems that punish truth-telling. He followed his orders. He prepared the fleet for battle, and he hoped, desperately, that all his fears were unfounded. They weren't. As Yamamoto dissected the Midway operational plan, The flaws glared at him. The entire strategy was built on a house of cards, a series of 5 critical assumptions, any one of which, if wrong, could bring the whole structure crashing down. First, the plan assumed that Japanese naval codes, specifically JN-25, were secure. It presumed the Americans had no idea a massive attack was coming. Second, it assumed the American carriers, the most vital targets, were still licking their wounds in Pearl Harbor and could be caught by surprise. Third, it relied on a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to successfully draw American forces north, away from the real target. Fourth, it believed Midway's defenses could be quickly neutralized by an initial airstrike. And fifth, it gambled that when the American ships did finally respond, they would sail piecemeal into a perfectly laid Japanese trap and be destroyed. Yamamoto had profound doubts about every single one of these assumptions. During a tense planning meeting with his staff, he directly challenged the issue of code security. What if the Americans have broken JN-25? What if they know we're coming? His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, was dismissive, embodying the very overconfidence Yamamoto feared. The code is unbreakable, Admiral. Our cryptographers have assured us. Even if the Americans intercept some messages, they can't possibly decrypt them in time to matter. Yamamoto pressed on, his voice laced with an urgency his subordinates mistook for pessimism. The Americans are not stupid. They have skilled codebreakers. We should assume our communications are compromised and plan accordingly. Ugaki, a man known for his rigid adherence to doctrine, grew impatient. With all due respect, Admiral, you are being overly cautious. We have achieved total surprise in every operation since Pearl Harbor. There is no reason to think this will be different. But Yamamoto knew there was a reason. It had happened just the month before. The Doolittle raid. American B-25 bombers had struck Tokyo itself, a devastating psychological blow to a nation that believed its homeland was inviolable. Those bombers had launched from aircraft carriers that had somehow approached Japan undetected and then vanished. This suggested an American intelligence and operational capability far greater than Japanese planners were willing to admit. It was a clear signal that the Americans were not the predictable, demoralized enemy the Japanese high command imagined them to be. The sheer complexity of the plan also troubled Yamamoto. Multiple fleets spread across thousands of miles of ocean, all operating on precise timetables, all under a strict policy of radio silence to maintain surprise. The margin for error was non-existent. What if the timing is off? He had asked his staff. What if one element is delayed? The entire plan depends on perfect coordination. Again, his concerns were waved away with patriotic fervor. Our sailors are the best in the world. They will execute the plan as designed. It was an answer based on faith, not on logic. The most dangerous assumption in Yamamoto's view concerned the location of the American carriers. The entire trap was predicated on them being in Pearl Harbor, requiring days to sail to Midway after the attack began. But what if they are not there? He insisted. What if American intelligence has warned them? What if they are already at sea waiting for us? We need better reconnaissance, Yamamoto had demanded. We need to know exactly where the American carriers are before we commit our main force. But even this part of the plan was already failing. A planned seaplane reconnaissance flight over Pearl Harbor, codenamed Operation K, had been canceled. A submarine picket line intended to spot American ships leaving Hawaii was positioned too late. The American carriers had already sailed past them, into the vast, empty Pacific, their movements hidden from Japanese eyes. Yamamoto could see the disaster taking shape, like watching a slow-motion train wreck, but he couldn't stop it. The plan had a momentum of its own. The fleet was being assembled. The die was cast. In a private, unguarded moment with one of his most trusted officers, Yamamoto was grimly honest. This operation troubles me. We are making too many assumptions about the enemy's weakness and our own invincibility. If even one of our assumptions is wrong, if the Americans are waiting for us, this could end very badly. The officer tried to reassure him. But surely, Admiral, our carrier force, the Kido Butai, is superior. It has never been defeated. Yamamoto looked out at the assembled fleet, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever put to sea. Never defeated, yes, he replied softly, but also never tested against an enemy who knows we're coming. Victory disease has infected our planning. We believe our own propaganda, and that is when the greatest mistakes happen. His fears were about to be put to the ultimate test. As a final validation, a series of war games were conducted aboard the Yamato. These exercises were meant to be a dress rehearsal, a chance to test the plan, identify weaknesses, and refine tactics. What actually happened was a horrifying preview of the disaster to come, and a perfect demonstration of how deeply the poison of victory disease had infected the Japanese high command. Yamamoto observed the games with growing unease. The officer playing the American side, attempting to think like an aggressive American commander, made a bold and logical move. He launched a surprise carrier strike on the Japanese fleet at its moment of maximum vulnerability, while it was recovering aircraft from the initial Midway attack. The umpires calculated the results. 2 Japanese carriers would be hit and put out of action, possibly sunk. The meticulously choreographed Japanese plan would collapse into chaos. It was a stunning, almost perfect simulation of what would actually happen in the real battle. But Rear Admiral Ugaki, serving as the chief umpire, simply overruled reality. Such an outcome is unrealistic, he declared, waving his hand dismissively. American morale is broken. They will not be that aggressive. With a flick of his wrist, he undid the damage. The carriers are restored to operational status. Yamamoto watched this blatant manipulation of reality with dismay. The war game had just handed them a critical warning on a silver platter, showing them precisely where the plan could fail. And rather than address it, rather than adjust the plan to account for this vulnerability, they had simply erased the problem. He spoke up, his tone measured and careful. Perhaps we should consider what would happen if the American carriers do attack during our most vulnerable moment. How would we respond? Ugaki was firm. Admiral Yamamoto, the scenario is too unlikely to merit serious consideration. We are planning for realistic contingencies, not worst-case fantasies. But to Yamamoto, who understood the American fighting spirit, it wasn't a fantasy. It was exactly what a determined, well-informed American commander would do. Strike when their enemies' decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The war game had given them the answer key to the test, and they had chosen to burn it. They ignored the warning because acknowledging it would mean admitting the plan was flawed. And in the Imperial Japanese Navy of 1942, questioning an approved plan was tantamount to questioning the Emperor's divine will. Yamamoto left the war games with a sense of foreboding he could not shake. They were about to sail into battle based on a plan that had already been proven to be fatally vulnerable. June 4th, 1942. Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, steaming 300 miles behind his carrier strike force. The main body of the combined fleet was arrayed around him: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, an overwhelming display of firepower. All of it was strategically useless. This was not going to be a battleship fight. It was a carrier battle. And Yamamoto ES carriers were too far ahead for him to influence the action in any meaningful way. This was yet another flaw in the plan. The fleet was so dispersed that its different elements couldn't support each other. Yamamoto's battleships, which might have provided a crucial screen of additional anti-aircraft defense for the carriers, were a full day's sailing away. If something went wrong, he could do nothing but listen to the dispatches. The early reports were positive. The strike on Midway had launched successfully. The base was being hit hard. Some American aircraft had counterattacked, but they had been swatted from the sky without scoring a single hit. Everything seemed to be going according to the script. Then came the message that changed everything. The message that made Yamamoto's blood run cold. Enemy force of 10 ships sighted. The Americans were already here. Not in Pearl Harbor, not days away. They were here, now, waiting. His worst fear, the one he had voiced and seen dismissed time and again, had come true. The Americans had known. They had broken the code. They had set a trap. And the mighty Kido Butai, the pride of the Imperial Navy, had sailed right into it. Minutes later, another electrifying message crackled over the radio. Enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. The bridge of the Yamato erupted in a flurry of shocked discussion. How could this be? The intelligence had been clear. The American carriers were supposed to be in port. This was impossible. But Yamamoto knew it wasn't impossible. It was exactly what he had feared. The Americans had read their mail. They knew where and when to be. And now, Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, was facing the battle of his life against an enemy that had achieved complete surprise. Yamamoto issued orders to increase speed, a desperate attempt to close the distance, but he knew it was futile. Even at flank speed, the Yamato couldn't reach the battle area before nightfall. Whatever happened out there, Nagumo and his carriers were on their own. The morning dragged on with agonizing slowness. Messages from the carrier force were sporadic and confused. American torpedo bombers were attacking in waves. They were being driven off, but they were persistent, heroic. Nagumo was recovering his strike aircraft and preparing a counterattack. Then, at 10:30 a.m., a message arrived that made Yamamoto's heart stop. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu hit by dive bombers. Heavy fires. Silence fell across the bridge of the Yamato. It was a thick, suffocating silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 3 carriers, the core of their fleet, hit simultaneously. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be happening, but it was. Within minutes, more horrifying details arrived. All 3 carriers were burning out of control. Secondary explosions from stored ordnance and fuel were tearing them apart from the inside. The irreplaceable air groups were being evacuated. The ships were being abandoned. Yamamoto stood frozen, a statue of stone on his own bridge, staring at the messages. In a span of perhaps 5 minutes, the heart of the Japanese carrier force had been ripped out. The Kido Butai, invincible for 6 months, had been destroyed. His staff looked to him for orders, for guidance, for a sign of what to do next. But what orders could he give? He was 300 miles away. The battle was lost. The plan had collapsed, exactly as he had foreseen. One of his officers, his voice shaking, asked, "Admiral, should we proceed with the invasion? Perhaps the battleships can provide gunfire support." Yamamoto shook his head, a slow, grim finality in the movement. Without carriers, without air cover, the invasion force would be slaughtered by American air power. The operation was over. More than over. It was a catastrophe. "Order Admiral Nagumo to withdraw the remaining forces," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Cancel the invasion. All units are to retire to the west." It was one of the hardest orders he had ever given, an admission of total, abject defeat. But there was no alternative. To continue would be to compound the disaster. As the reports continued to trickle in throughout the day, the full, staggering scale of the defeat became clear. Not just 3 carriers, but 4. The Hiryu, after launching a desperate and heroic counterattack that crippled the American carrier Yorktown, had also been hit and was sinking. Over 3,000 men, Japan's most experienced naval aviators, the irreplaceable core of its naval air power, were dead or dying. That night, alone in his cabin on the most powerful battleship in the world, a ship that had not fired a single shot in anger, Yamamoto faced the crushing reality of what had happened. The plan he had doubted, the operation he had questioned, had failed exactly as he had feared. And because he had lacked the final courage to oppose it more forcefully, because he had valued his position and the harmony of the high command over his own convictions, thousands of men were dead, and Japan's strategic position was crippled beyond repair. The window for victory had just slammed shut. Whether Yamamoto knew the end was coming, whether he suspected the Americans had read his mail one final time, is unknown. But there is a tragic, poetic irony in the manner of his death. He was killed by the very same intelligence failure he had warned his superiors about. The same American code-breaking capability that had doomed the Midway operation had now claimed his life. With Yamamoto's death, Japan lost its most capable and clear-eyed naval strategist, and arguably the one senior officer who truly understood the war's grim strategic reality. His successors were either true believers in Japan's divine destiny for victory, or political officers unwilling to speak uncomfortable truths to power. After the war, when historians and military analysts examined the Battle of Midway in the clear light of hindsight, Yamamoto's fears and warnings were completely and tragically vindicated. Every single concern he had raised had been legitimate. Every assumption he had questioned had been disastrously wrong. The Americans had broken JN-25. They had known about the attack. They had been waiting in ambush. The plan had been too complex, and its execution had been compromised by rigid doctrine and poor tactical decisions. And the battle had been the turning point that doomed Japan's strategic position in the Pacific. American officers who interrogated surviving Japanese commanders after the war were struck by a consistent theme. Many admitted, with the clarity of defeat, that Yamamoto had been the only senior leader who truly grasped American industrial capacity and the impossibility of winning a long war. One Japanese officer, in his post-war debriefing, stated it plainly. Admiral Yamamoto told us before the war that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that, he had no confidence. Midway happened almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. He was right, but by the time we realized he was right, it was too late. The cold, hard production numbers bore out Yamamoto's warnings with brutal finality. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 300,000 military aircraft. The Battle of Midway was the critical moment, not simply because Japan lost 4 carriers, but because it proved that every single assumption underpinning Japanese strategy was false. American morale wasn't broken. American intelligence wasn't blind. American industrial capacity was even greater than Yamamoto had feared. And yet, none of his warnings had been heeded until it was too late. His story is a tragic parallel seen throughout history. Like Admiral Canaris in Germany, warning about American industrial capacity and being ignored. Like Albert Speer calculating that Germany couldn't win a production war and remaining silent. Like Adolf Galland recognizing American air superiority and being called a defeatist. In every case, competent professionals saw strategic reality clearly and were trapped in systems where truth was subordinate to ideology, where loyalty meant unquestioning agreement, and where challenging approved plans was career-ending, or worse. Yamamoto's story is a profound tragedy of knowledge without power. He understood America better than any other Japanese officer. He warned that Japan could only win a short war. He predicted that a long war would end in defeat. He questioned the Midway Plan's assumptions. He tried to inject realistic assessment into strategic planning, and he was overruled, dismissed, or ignored every single time. Not because his assessments were wrong, but because they contradicted what people wanted to believe. Victory disease, the conviction of inevitable Japanese superiority, was so deeply embedded in the military culture that contradictory evidence was rejected automatically. His final vindication was a bitter one. He had been right about everything: the short war window, American industrial might, the Midway Plan's flaws, the inevitable long war of attrition. But being right didn't save his men at Midway. It didn't prevent the war. It didn't lead to peace negotiations before total defeat. It just meant he had the agonizing experience of watching his every bleak prediction come true, while being powerless to prevent it. The lesson extends far beyond World War II. When systems punish truth-telling and reward conformity, when ideology becomes more important than evidence, when loyalty means never questioning approved plans, catastrophic failure becomes inevitable. Midway wasn't lost in the 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks on June 4, 1942. It was lost in the months of planning, when legitimate concerns were dismissed, when war games were rigged to produce favorable outcomes, and when intelligence warnings were ignored. Yamamoto saw it all. He understood it, and he couldn't stop it. That is the real tragedy of Midway from the Japanese side. Not the loss of ships or the death of pilots, but the fact that it was all avoidable, if only anyone had been willing to listen to the one man who understood what they were truly up against. In the end, reality does not negotiate. Mathematics doesn't care about fighting spirit. Industrial capacity trumps tactical brilliance. And the admiral who knew all of this, who tried to warn his nation, was silenced by the same cultural forces that ensured Japan's ultimate defeat. His wisdom was vindicated, but by then, it was far too late.